God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Thomas Jefferson.
Liberty as a gift of God, wrote Thomas Jefferson in 1781, the idea that rights and freedom come not from a king or a government, but a creator. At the birth of our nation, these were revolutionary thoughts. There is no attack on American culture more destructive and more historically dishonest than the relentless effort to drive God out of America's public square.
But unlike those who want to outlaw the words "under God," the Founding Fathers believed that God was central to defining America and to securing the blessings of liberty for our new nation.
The Founders understood that for a republic to work, it required a kind of civic virtue. And most of them recognized that civic virtue was connected in some way or another to private individual virtue. Most people then, and I would argue most people now, get their cues as to what constitutes virtue, get their code of ethics from some form of religion.
It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the Revolution. James Madison.
Hello, I'm Newt Gingrich.
And I'm Callista Gingrich.
The next time someone says that religious expression has no place in the public square, take them on a stroll through Washington, D.C.
As you visit the monuments and memorials in our nation's capital, you will quickly find yourself on a profound and surprising walk of discovery. This walking tour is not just a look at the architecture and beauty of our nation's capital. It is a tour of our American history, of the great men and women, events, documents, and ideas that are at the heart of our freedom and our identity as Americans.
Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. George Washington.
You know, I think there's no question about it that Washington felt that morality, virtue, strong values were essential if people were going to rule themselves, that you had to have those things, and that he felt that organized religion fostered all of those things.
The founders certainly said often enough that without morals and religion, a government like ours, a republic, could not be made to work.
For the founders, it was clear. Religious liberty and freedom of expression would be a cornerstone of our democratic government and pluralistic society.
What the Founding Fathers really wanted to do was promote religious freedom, and they wanted to stop taxation, which they deemed unfair by Great Britain. Those are the two principal pillars of the creating of our country, and virtually all the Founding Fathers believed in those two goals to one degree or another.
Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. John Adams.
The genius of the founders was the realization that religious belief and expression, though woven into the fabric of the nation, was optional. Though most were religious men, some devoutly so, they chose to link liberty to a divine hand without advocating one religion or another, or making belief compulsory.
The framers weren't simply devoutly Christian believers who were unapologetic boosters for the role of religion in the public square, and yet at the same time, the framers were not anti-clerical deists who saw no role for religion in the public square. The truth is the framers are a complex group of people that inhabit both of those ends of the spectrum, but more importantly, inhabit a much larger area in the middle in which these questions of the proper role for religion in the public square were vital and important, and which they themselves contested and struggled with.
Our purpose is neither theological nor an effort to advocate any religious worldview. Our purpose is a historical journey to rediscover the Founding Fathers' understanding of what is required to sustain liberty in a free society.
There were a variety of views about the role of government in regard to religion, but almost all believed in freedom of conscience and individual religious liberty. Government should not interfere with religion. At the same time, government was not hostile to religion.
And that's the great beauty of our founding documents, is they provide a balance of things like the role of religion and the role of individual rights, the roles of the states, the roles of the federal government. That balance is delicate, but it's beautiful.
Join us on our walking tour of America's capital city. Together, we'll rediscover that our nation was indeed founded under God. For 2 generations, we have passively accepted an assault on the core principle of American civilization that our rights come from God. This assault is led by an academic, legal, and media elite that finds religious expression frightening, threatening, old-fashioned, and unsophisticated.
And therefore, there's something like a culture war going on. That never happened before in American history. And so we're in a new situation. It's as if some were trying to take up George Washington's dare in his farewell address, you know, when he says he would not take lightly the thought that a republic could survive without religion and morality. Some people want to make that test, can it? Let's deprive, let's suffocate, let's cut off the oxygen to the religious roots of America and the religious roots of American morality, and see if the republic survives.
But for most Americans, this effort to impose a ruthlessly secular society that forbids public reference to God and systematically removes all religious symbols from the public square is appalling.
I think people realize that the history and the principles and the ideals and values of our country have always recognized the importance of our Creator, and that to artificially try to remove those references today because of the limited views and the hostility of some people to religion, most people believe that's wrong.
Separation church and state today means secularize the public arena. Separation church and state 200 years ago meant keep the 2 institutions separate, but don't shut off the influences. We want the religious influence. We don't want a secularized society. We just don't want the church running the government or the government running the church.
Here in our nation's capital, there is ample evidence that our Founding Fathers, as well as our social and political leaders, have acknowledged the influence of our Creator in our nation's history.
Our first stop is the repository of our country's most important documents, the National Archives. Upon entering the National Archives, you will see an image of the 10 Commandments engraved in bronze on the floor. This image signifies that our legal system has its origins in the Judeo-Christian beliefs brought by the Pilgrims and others to the New World.
In the rotunda of the National Archives, inside a sealed bronze case, lies the most consequential document in the history of human freedom, the Declaration of Independence.
Well, the first thing you remember about the Founding Fathers is that they were revolutionaries. They overthrew the government, the whole system that they had inherited, and they set up something entirely new. So these were bold individuals.
When the Continental Congress decided it needed a declaration to explain why we were going to war, they appointed a committee that had Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin on it, among others. And you can see in the editing and writing of the Declaration how they were trying to balance things. For example, in that famous second paragraph, Jefferson's first draft begins, "We hold these truths to be sacred." And then you see Franklin's black printer's pen with backslashes, and he writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And his point was we were trying to create a new type of government that depended on rationality and reason and the consent of the governed, as well as dictates of religion. And then the sentence goes on and it says, they're endowed with certain inalienable rights. And you see John Adams' handwriting, writing in, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So just in the editing of one half of one sentence of the Declaration, you see the great founders trying to balance the role of divine providence in our Lord in creating our nation with the role of rights, rationality, reason, and the consent of the governed. And they were able to bring us together with the writing of that document instead of using that document to pull us apart.
Drafted by Thomas Jefferson between June 11th and June 28th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence boldly describes, in exalted and unforgettable language, the relationship between individual rights and human liberty.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson.
You know, the Declaration begins when in the course of human events. Jefferson, I think, telegraphs here that he sees an order in history. That is, that history isn't just an assemblage of event after event after event, but rather there's a progress to it, there's a pattern to it, there's a development to it. That course of events, the guiding hand or the pattern in that course of events, he refers to it in many cases as the hand of the Creator or as providence. At the level of the cosmos, at the level of creation itself, clearly he sees the hand of what he calls providence or the Creator. Which we might call God.
You know, America at that time was often called the Second Israel. It was a people wandering not in a desert, as the ancient Hebrews had, but in a wilderness. That's why even on the seal of the United States, they had the idea of making an image of the people of Israel. And a motto proposed by Benjamin Franklin was that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. And it was that sense of liberation that Israel had to go through.
He said we need Moses holding up his rod in the wilderness with a pillar of fire, a pillar of cloud, and all of God's enemies being destroyed by the overwhelming sea. So Franklin is a deist, but not at all is he a believer in an impersonal providence.
And they ended up putting a pyramid on the seal of the United States, suggesting Egypt and the desert around it, and uncompleted because they thought any country given to liberty and justice for all was never going to quite get there. There was always going to be more to do.
Novus Ordo Seclorum means a new order for the ages, and that fits both with the religionists' understanding of America as the New Jerusalem, as well as with the deist understanding of America as a new age of reason.
Also on display in the rotunda is the Constitution of the United States.
The reason that in the Constitution it begins, "We the people," was to make it clear that it was not the states themselves, which are governmental entities, nor the government, the federal government, that established both the rights and the responsibilities and the structure of our government. The ultimate source of governmental authority is the consent of the governed. And that's how "we the people" was very important to the way in which the Constitution was written.
The First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
I think the First Amendment makes it clear that we shouldn't establish any particular religion, but it also allows us to practice religion even publicly if we want to. That balance, which we sometimes struggle with, is a good set of balances, understanding that there should be no establishment of any type of religion, and yet there can be a civic virtue and a respect for religion even in the public sphere.
The government is not a Christian government. The government is very much influenced by Christianity, has some Christian principles, biblical principles, undergirding it, but it does its working separately, and quite properly so. That's part of the Jewish and Christian understanding of how it ought to be.
Contrary to those who want to eliminate religious expression from the public square, these important words were written to protect freedom of religion, not freedom from religion.
The First Amendment, in its religion clause, was established to prohibit the federal government from establishing a national church. It was not a refutation or was not in any way hostile to religion in general, either in public or in private.
I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? Benjamin Franklin.
At 81, Benjamin Franklin was the oldest member of the Constitutional Convention. He and the other founding fathers made certain the language of the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights made clear their intentions of forging a nation that acknowledged a divine creator.
At the Constitutional Convention, when things are breaking down, Benjamin Franklin makes a motion that they should have prayer at the convention. And he says if a sparrow falls, it cannot fall without his notice. Well, Franklin is trying to remind them that they're in the presence of an Almighty who's larger than themselves, and that should lead some humility. One of the interesting things is Franklin gets voted down. There's really a sense that you shouldn't be mixing religion too much with the making of laws.
Our walking tour next leads us to one of the most popular attractions in our capital city, the Washington Monument.
From its base to its aluminum capstone, this memorial dedicated to our first president is filled with references to our creator. This is no coincidence, as Washington's writings contain numerous references to God.
Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. George Washington.
You know, the religion of Washington is a pretty controversial subject today, and it's something that scholars don't always agree on. I personally believe that Washington was a man of great faith. I think faith was very important to him. I think in his writings he uses the words providence and the helping hand of God over and over and over again.
No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. George Washington.
The words under God come first of all from George Washington himself. In his general orders to the Army, he said to his troops, "You must understand that now you are under God, the only defense of our liberties." If you don't have a munitions factory, Army, or Navy, you better have faith in divine providence. You don't have a lot to go on, and he did.
When Washington took the oath of office on April 30th, 1789, he asked that the Bible be opened to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28. Immediately following the oath, Washington added, "So help me God." He bent forward and kissed the Bible before him. Washington then delivered America's first inaugural address, in which he made note of America's indebtedness to our Creator.
In his inaugural address, he says that God touched us every step of the way to this victory. And so there's no one who more quickly and more strongly recognized that God was on our side, and without him, we simply would not have won.
When the Washington Monument was completed in 1884, it became the world's tallest structure at 555 feet. The day was commemorated by a ceremony placing a capstone at the top of the monument. The east side of the capstone is inscribed in Latin, Laus Deo, which means, praise be to God.
And I think he loved the fact that the top of it had the inscription, give praise to God, because that's what Washington did at every point in his life.
Those who have not been to the Jefferson Memorial may find it surprising to see it included in a walking tour.
After all, Thomas Jefferson was the author of the famous letter calling for a wall of separation between church and state. However, while Jefferson often stressed the importance of questioning all things, including the existence of God, his writings and the way he governed make it clear. Jefferson believed that American liberty relied on the protection of divine providence.
It was not until 1934 that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt persuaded Congress to honor our third president with a memorial.
Upon entering the Jefferson Memorial, inscribed below the dome are the following words written by Thomas Jefferson.
I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. Thomas Jefferson.
This is one of the most self-denying views of liberty in the history of the human race, because it doesn't ask for Jews or Christians one liberty and something else for everybody else. No, it says the liberty this God cares about belongs to all, even if they turn against God. God made us so. So it belongs to atheists, Hindus, Muslims, and so forth. Everybody together.
Of the 4 panels inside the dome, 3 contain references to God.
People don't understand that Jefferson had a great appreciation for religion and a great love of God. He's often kind of written off as he didn't really care. He was a staunch believer in separation of church and state. He was a staunch believer in individual religions being allowed to flourish in America with equanimity. But he was not somebody who had a kind of just flat out disbelief that there was some kind of higher being, as sometimes gets miswritten about and mistalked about in our society.
You point to treaties with Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, 1803, the treaty he negotiated with the Kaskaskia Indians. He used federal funds to pay for missionaries to go live among the Indians, and Jefferson also used federal funds to pay for churches to be built in which the Indians could worship. And he didn't see a problem with that, and he's supposed to be the strict separationist.
Jefferson himself denied those who claimed he was hostile toward religion. In a letter to a colleague, Jefferson wrote,
My views are the result of a life of inquiry and reflection, and very different from that anti-Christian system imputed to me by those who know nothing of my opinions. Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptists that in modern days has often been misunderstood and really distorted as to its meaning. The Danbury Baptists were concerned that the government was somehow going to interfere with their form of worship. And so they requested the president to write to them and explain to them his views on this aspect of it. And he made it clear when he talked about a separation of church and state, it was to keep government, to keep the state from interfering with religion. It was not to separate the public or public activities from religion, or to keep religion out of the public square.
From the Jefferson Memorial, we turn to the Lincoln Memorial. Like Jefferson, President Lincoln understood that our rights come from our Creator. Lincoln relied upon divine providence to guide the nation through the Civil War.
I think it was very important for Lincoln to believe that there was some grand providential design behind this horrible experience the country was going through, because it weighed on Lincoln's mind every day that tens of thousands, ultimately hundreds of thousands of people were dying for this cause that Lincoln had elevated to the highest level in American politics.
We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Abraham Lincoln.
He seems to have had his religious faith, or his belief in providence, as he typically would have put it, deepened by this great crisis.
President Lincoln's second inaugural address concludes,
With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to finish the work we are in. Abraham Lincoln.
Nearly 100 years following these words from President Lincoln, it was altogether fitting that the great civil rights leader Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech on these very steps.
I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
You can't help but listen to that speech and just get chills going up and down your spine. I mean, and here is a man, Dr. King, who was willing to go to jail for his beliefs, who was willing to use the pulpit of the church and the rough and tumble of street protest politics to say, I believe in America, but we have to do better.
It was the most natural thing in the world for King to appeal to the memory of America's greatest president, a man who arguably had been martyred for his support of racial equality. And so it was good politics, good history, and extremely moving for King to appeal to the memory of Lincoln.
If I had my way, this war would have never been commenced. If I had been allowed my way, this war would have ended before this. But we find it still continues, and we must believe that he permits it for some wise purpose of his own, mysterious and unknown to us. Abraham Lincoln.
How can our students understand Lincoln during the Civil War without understanding his firm resolution in the Gettysburg Address that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom?
Our walking tour continues at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, where we can reflect on the heritage of this great president.
Many consider FDR to be the father of modern liberalism, so it may surprise you to know that as president, he unapologetically linked the preservation of our nation during World War II with the preservation of our religion.
Franklin Roosevelt was a deeply religious man. You know, when he was struck with polio, he had to find faith. It was through prayer that Roosevelt was able to stay so strong.
In early June of 1944, with knowledge that thousands might die in the D-Day invasion of Normandy Beach, Roosevelt began writing a prayer that he would deliver on radio to the nation. It was Roosevelt's appeal to Almighty God.
Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. O Lord, give us faith. Give us faith in thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other, faith in our united crusade. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen.
People talk about the separation of church and state, and here is Franklin Roosevelt at perhaps our most crucial and potentially darkest hour as a nation, at least since the beginnings of the Civil War. And here he was trying to rally the people together through prayer. And it's a side of Franklin Roosevelt that often gets missed.
FDR's first term, from 1933 to 1937, occurred during the Great Depression, a time of widespread economic and spiritual hardship.
If you go back and read his speeches, over and over again, he evokes God and country in the same breath, and he asks the people of the United States to do a collective prayer.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
When he says so powerfully, you have nothing to fear but fear itself trying to get us out of the Great Depression. The strength of that voice is coming from a man who prayed regularly and was a great believer in God and the tenets of Christianity.
Franklin Roosevelt understood what President Washington understood before him, that religion and morality are indispensable to the preservation of our liberty and our freedom.
We humbly ask the blessing of God. May He protect each and every one of us. May He guide me in the days to come.
Thus far, we've seen examples of how our greatest leaders drew upon their faith in our Creator, both for strength and guidance to lead this country.
It only makes sense that these leaders would design a capital that reflects that same source of inspiration.
Human government is more or less perfect as it approaches nearer or diverges farther from the imitation of this perfect plan of divine and moral government. John Adams.
No structure defines Washington more than the United States Capitol. Many of our greatest national leaders and thinkers have served under its great dome.
The building was very impressive not only to Americans but also to foreign visitors. So people like Alexis de Tocqueville and Charles Dickens and Fanny Trollope sat in the galleries of the House and the Senate. In addition to reporting on the debates they heard, they talked about how impressive the chambers were and how they reflected well on this very young republic.
Upon entering the Capitol, visitors see a rotunda filled with religious imagery and inscriptions.
Throughout the building, you'll see signs of religious history, from the pilgrims praying to Pocahontas being baptized to scenes of religious leaders. So Moses is depicted as one of the great lawgivers in the House of Representatives chambers, but so is Suleiman, who is a Muslim, and so are people who we would consider pagans today, as well as popes and others who had religious affiliations.
The founders felt that religion was very important and that it should be practiced in the public square. It was just a matter of not preferring one religion over another or prescribing something as the, quote, official, unquote, religion of the federal government.
When Jefferson became president in 1800, there were really only two churches in Washington, D.C., and the House chaplain thought that perhaps since the House chamber was a fairly large room, that it could be made available to church services on Sunday. And so beginning in the fall of 1800, they began holding church services in the House chamber.
There was no hesitation on the part of Thomas Jefferson and others to use government facilities for religious purposes as long as they would be made available on an equal basis for anyone who wanted to use them. And that's why Thomas Jefferson himself felt it appropriate to have religious services in the Capitol, to which he faithfully attended.
James Madison also attended church services in the Capitol. Madison clearly saw no conflict between favoring religious observances in public spaces and opposing an official national religion.
Whilst we assert a freedom to embrace, to profess, and to observe the religion which we believe to be of divine origin, we cannot deny an equal freedom to choose minds who have not yet yielded to the evidence which has convinced us. James Madison.
The United States Supreme Court is located just across the street from the Capitol. Climbing the steps to the main entrance, above the portico, one can see the inscription, "Equal Justice Under the Law."
Cass Gilbert, the architect, took his basic model for the Supreme Court building from the Parthenon in Greece, which of course started its long life as a temple. And really, the Supreme Court is a kind of temple and has come to be known in the common parlance as our temple of justice.
Recent years have seen increasing hostility from the courts to public displays of religion. Ironically, the U.S. Supreme Court is filled with religious symbolism.
The Supreme Court is really full of imagery of religious and secular lawgivers from throughout history, from all times and all places. Moses figures very prominently in the sculptures and pediments and friezes of the Supreme Court. Of course, he was the great Hebrew leader and the one to whom God gave the 10 Commandments. In fact, the 10 Commandments themselves are depicted in one of the friezes of Moses. Solon, the great Greek lawgiver, Confucius, to bring in the Eastern tradition, and the fact that all of these great figures, including Mohammed, are depicted throughout the friezes and sculptures of the Supreme Court, I think really shows the universality of law, and indeed kind of weaves together the fact that all law comes from a common source. Every session of the Supreme Court opens with an invocation, which is essentially a prayer. The marshal stands up and says, "God save the United States and this honorable court." Like much of our law, the roots stem back to the common law in England. And of course, in England, what was commonly said in courtrooms was, "God save the king." But as we said in the Declaration of Independence, the source of all of our law, the source of our rights, is our Creator, God. And so now the phrase, the invocation, the prayer that opens every court session is, "God save the United States and this honorable court."
Next to the Supreme Court is the Library of Congress. Originally established in 1800 as a legislative library, the Library of Congress today houses over 130 million items, including books, photographs, and recordings.
After the Capitol was burned in 1814 and the original collection of the Library of Congress was destroyed, Jefferson offered his library to the Congress, which was the largest private library in North America, over 6,000 volumes. And that established the basis of what is now the world's largest and richest library.
In the main reading room, there are several pieces of religious imagery and scripture. Once again, we find Moses holding the 10 Commandments. In a painting on the ceiling called Judea, we see a young Jewish woman praying.
In 1998, the Library of Congress held an exhibit called Religion and the Founding of the American Republic. This exhibit explored the role of religion in the colonies from Jamestown through the post-Revolutionary War era, a time when many of our governmental institutions were formed.
I think it's quite clear, it can be demonstrated that almost all the founders believed that religion was a kind of, you needed that as a grounding for republicanism, liberty, order, prosperity, you name it.
This Library of Congress exhibit revealed a deep truth about the American nation. As an astute observer of early America, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote,
"I do not know whether all Americans have a sincere faith in their religion, for who can read the human heart? But I am certain that they hold it to be indispensable to the maintenance of republican institutions. This opinion is not peculiar to a class of citizens or to a party, but it belongs to the whole nation and to every rank of society." Alexis de Tocqueville.
Those who wish to minimize the founders' belief in our Creator and diminish the role of religion in public life today would argue that de Tocqueville is irrelevant because he is writing about an earlier America.
Yet affirming the phrase, "under God," is more important than ever in a country as religiously diverse as America, because it is inclusive of all faiths and denominations.
They're determined, the Founding Fathers, to make sure that people weren't persecuted for their religious beliefs. The Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that if you were an atheist, or you were a Quaker, or you were Catholic, that you had some semblance of rights.
But I think the real importance is that a lot of them were very wise men. I think their analysis of some of the issues were intrinsically excellent, and I think that's why the founders ought to be consulted.
True religion affords to government its surest support. George Washington.
The White House is the quintessential symbol of the American presidency. The first cornerstone was laid in October of 1792. But despite overseeing much of the construction, President Washington never had a chance to live there.
Today, the White House celebrates many religious observances. Despite a number of legal challenges, visitors can still enjoy the national Christmas tree, Hanukkah menorah, and Easter egg roll. And it's important to remember that the overwhelming majority of our presidents and first ladies have been men and women of faith, deeply aware of the source of our freedom.
Let us raise a standard to which the wise and the honest can repair. The rest is in the hands of God. George Washington. Religion and virtue are the only foundations, not only of republicanism and of all free government, but of social felicity under all governments and in all combinations of human society. John Adams.
Surely God would not have created such a being as man with an ability to grasp the infinite, to exist only for a day. No, no, man was made for immortality. Abraham Lincoln.
We look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want. The fourth is freedom from fear.
We believe that all men are created equal because they are created in the image of God.
If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we will be a nation gone under.
If you get the chance to visit the White House, be sure to see the state dining room. The fireplace mantel contains an inscription from a letter written by President John Adams.
I pray to heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that hereafter inhabit it. John Adams.
Through the years, the White House has been the site of prayer services and other religious gatherings. After the Civil War, First Lady Lucy Hayes and President Rutherford B. Hayes hosted prayer services and hymn singing for members of the Cabinet, Congress, and their families.
To perpetuate the Union and to abolish slavery were the work of war. To educate the uneducated is the appropriate work of peace. Rutherford B. Hayes.
The real fire within the builders of America was faith. Faith in a provident God whose hand supported and guided them. Faith in themselves as the children of God, endowed with purposes beyond the mere struggle for survival. Faith in their country and its principles that proclaim man's right to freedom and justice, rights derived from his divine origin.
In 1953, President Dwight David Eisenhower hosted the National Prayer Breakfast out of a desire to meet with the House and Senate prayer groups and unite the nation's leaders under a common bond of faith.
Franklin Roosevelt was religious. Dwight Eisenhower was religious. They were raised in particular denominations. They were very comfortable with prayer, with religious observance. They also understood that Americans are an overwhelmingly religious people.
The next year, in 1954, President Eisenhower signed the bill officially adding the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance.
I think a succession of presidents have felt that it was both useful and proper to do things like have prayer breakfasts or to be there on Capitol Hill, and which opens its sessions with prayer. I think that's all part of our balance, and I think to keep those things in balance, not to ban things on one side, but not to force things too much on the other side, is what the founders would have wanted us to do as we balance the roles of church and state in their separate realms and when they intersect in the public sphere.
Our walking tour concludes at Arlington National Cemetery, where our country's religious heritage is revealed most sublimely.
Located just across the Potomac River, Arlington National Cemetery is the final resting place of over 300,000 of America's veterans and their families.
Arlington National Cemetery is important to America because it is here where our nation remembers its heroes, and not just our heroes that are famous in history books and all Americans know, but the heroes that are famous only to their friends and their families. Because it is truly those people that we owe the greatest debt. We're very lucky to enjoy these freedoms today, and Arlington shows the cost of that freedom.
One of the most popular sites in the cemetery is the Tomb of the Unknowns. The tomb holds the remains of unidentified American soldiers.
The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is where someone can come who's not only lost a family member who's never been returned to the United States, but also lost a family member serving in armed forces. It's become to represent all those that have died in our country. The inscription on the tomb, "Here rests in honor and glory an American soldier known but to God," was selected to mark the tomb when it was erected in 1932, and it appears on crosses of American cemeteries overseas in Europe. The author of the inscription is unknown, but it certainly is a very eloquent statement of how we should remember these unknown soldiers.
One of the most famous grave sites in Arlington National Cemetery, marked by an eternal flame, is that of President John F. Kennedy. Although his Catholic faith was an issue in the 1960 presidential campaign, President Kennedy never hesitated to publicly acknowledge his belief in God. Inscribed nearby is a quote from his famous inaugural address, which reads,
"With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own."
His references to faith, his references to being aware of how history will judge us in the future as Americans are as true today as they were when he spoke them 50 years ago.
I know there is a God and that he hates injustice. I see the storm coming, and his hand is in it. But if he has a place and a part for me, I believe that I am ready.
President Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, a very young man. No planning had been in place. No one anticipated that terrible day. And within 3 days, he was buried here in Arlington Cemetery.
Arlington National Cemetery represents our shared experience as Americans, our service, sacrifice, and faith.
The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God.
Our walking tour reminds us that our Creator is the source of our American liberty. On parchment, in rock, mortar, and marble, this belief is preserved for future generations.
I think the religious and moral supports to government are just as important as they ever were. And so if religion supports personal virtue, and if personal virtue supports civic virtue, then religion is important to the successful functioning of our republic.
And it's worth knowing that we're the only nation in the world that's been under the same piece of paper for more than 2 centuries now. We need to know that we're different because of the ideas. And so the next generation needs to know those ideas.
Our founding fathers were firm in their conviction that American liberties were a gift from God, not man. They were equally convinced that our continued political liberty would be tied to our continued religious liberty. That is why those who seek to weaken religious liberties in this country are threatening the very foundation of American civilization.
I think it's extremely important that young people today and young people in future generations understand the history and the significance of the founders, what their lives were like, the heroism that they showed, the great patriotism that they demonstrated. All of these things are an important part of understanding how our country came to be one of the freest and most prosperous nations in the history of the world.
I think it's very important for every citizen of this country, maybe everybody in the world, to read every now and then the founding documents of our country, the Declaration and the Constitution, to see how we balance the role of religion, the role of government, to be inspired by the fact that they use religion to pull us together, not to tear us apart, and to be inspired by their tolerance, their notion that no matter what you felt about God, what you felt about religion, you could be part of a civic society.
One of the great dilemmas our nation's having is that we somehow have learned to deprioritize our own story. People often will accuse a historian of being a triumphalist if you say America's been great, but look at all the amazing accomplishments this country's done.
We're unique among the nations in seeing the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty as interdependent together. This isn't the way it was in Europe, or is now in Europe, or Japan, or in any other part of the developed world. It's our particular inheritance.
At the end of the Revolutionary War, General George Washington wrote to the leaders of the newly free and independent United States of America. Washington offered a poignant prayer for the new nation and its citizens.
I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have you and the state over which you preside in his holy protection. And without an humble imitation of whose example in these things, we can ever hope to be a happy nation. George Washington.
Today, we echo Washington's earnest prayer for the future of the United States. We also share the belief that Washington expressed in his first inaugural address, that every step by which the United States has advanced as a nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency.
That is why it is essential we teach our children about what President Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory, that ancient and celestial harmony that unites America as the most exceptional nation in history. From the settlement of Jamestown to the fields of Gettysburg and beyond, and to each living heart today that strives to make a better life for themselves, their families, and their communities. I'm Callista Gingrich.
And I'm Newt Gingrich. Thank you for watching.